Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Namita Wahi, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you in this room, as well as our audience on Facebook Live, to the 13th talk in the Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative Speaker Series. Today, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Raghav Chandra, who will be speaking to us about on the issues of tribes, forests, and the environment. Mr. Chandra is an officer with the Indian Administrative Services, and he's currently Secretary to the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes. The National Commission for Scheduled Tribes is a constitutional body which was created in 2003 pursuant to Article 338A of the Constitution. Mr. Chandra is also a member of the Senior Group of Secretaries on Social Development and Education. He has earlier been Chairman of the National Highway Authority of India in Delhi, as well as Joint Secretary, Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. Mr. Chandra has written extensively for and been featured in reputed media outlets on various issues relating to the environment, sustainability, and other economic issues. His recent op-ed in the Business Standard, there are a few copies of that outside as well. He's also the author of a book called Scent of a Game, which is based on the trade in endangered species. Mr. Chandra is an alumnus of Harvard University and Delhi University. And today he is going to talk to us about the plight of the scheduled tribes today and the social and economic challenges they face even after 7 decades of independence from colonial rule, even though there have been a slew of legislative policy and constitutional measures to ameliorate the plight of the scheduled tribes. So a very warm welcome to you once again, and without further ado, I will turn over the mic to him.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can use that.
To Namita, and great to be here amidst a very, very interested audience on a subject which is otherwise would appear to be quite drab. Friends, I'm going to be speaking, as Namita said, on the intersection of issues connected with tribes, forests, and environment. I have earlier also been Commissioner of Tribal Development in the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is a large tribe-oriented state. So I do have field experience from the state as well as experience of working in Government of India. I must say that most often we tend to take this subject rather lightly, even though about 9% of our population is of tribes, and they are clearly the most backward economically and socially of all citizen groups, and therefore it is our bounden responsibility to think more objectively, more compassionately about them, to discuss their issues, to deliberate on them, and to try and resolve them. Tribes are truly, in my view, the children of nature. They worship and follow all the rules of nature. Trees, for instance, symbolize for them the everlasting energy which is latent in nature and in Mother Earth. They do not believe in wantonly cutting a tree, for it is their Dev, their benefactor and their protector. They use only the fruit and the extractable elements of the tree such that it remains alive. Even the fruit that they pick should be ripe, and rarely will they cut a tree unless it is absolutely imperative to do so. That too, after they have prayed to absolve themselves of their action of cutting a tree. For instance, the Gonds of Madhya Pradesh will normally not pick the amla, which is the Indian gooseberry, before the auspicious day of Amla Navami in autumn. The forest is essentially sacred for all tribes. The tribal belief is that they are born from the womb of nature and will return to it after their demise. That is why they express their eternal indebtedness to nature and also equate the earth with it, venerating it as their mother. Sometimes they, as for instance in the case of the Begas of Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, and I'm just mentioning a tribe, it could be many more tribes that follow this, perhaps all tribes follow this. go to the extent of not adopting plough cultivation and continue with shifting cultivation, since ploughing, where the iron share is used in cutting across the soil, amounts to lacerating the breasts of Mother Earth, an act which they equate with matricide. A parallel to this can be drawn with no-till cultivation for carbon capture, which is being advocated today in some parts of the Western world. Because of this respect for Mother Earth, tribesmen are extremely cautious about the use of resources, drawing only upon those that they need for their bare minimum survival. It is this frugality in today's consumerist world which makes tribes unique. Tribes are inseparable from and integral to the very survival and sustainability of the forest ecosystem. Neither can survive in isolation from the other. In the past, tribes had to surrender their forests and their minerals to the exploiters. In fact, I would hazard that the history of tribal society is a history of the exploitation of the tribes and not one of their inherent potentialities, their wisdom, or how they can be benefited or how they could benefit society. And yet, tribes continue as the sentinels of peace, guarding nature, seldom over-exploiting it, and always happy with less. Various committees from time to time of the government have concluded, and I'm just quoting the Bhuria committee, but many others have said this: tribal life and economy in the not too distant past bore a harmonious relationship with nature and its endowment. It was an example of sustainable development, but with the influx of outside population, it has suffered grievous blows. The colonial system was established on the basis of expropriation of the natural and economic resources of tribals. Currently, tribals and tribes are defined as those that possess primitive traits, subscribe to a distinct culture, are geographically isolated, suffer from backwardness, and are shy of establishing contact with the strangers and the outside world. India has about 705 scheduled tribes, and the population is about 104 million, comprising 8.6% of the total population of India. In terms of geographical area that they cover, it's about 13% of the overall geographical area of India. Colonial powers have viewed Indian forests and terrain in a very mercantilist way, as a resource, as an exploitable asset, driven essentially by the profit motive that underlined the East India Company, the forerunner of the British Raj. Thus, they approached our forests as the perfect source of timber for building their railroads, our railroads, for railway sleepers, and for the housing surge in Europe and England. Another significant development was that two gentlemen, Heatley and Summer of the East India Company, located coal in many tribal blocks way back in 1774. Examination revealed that they were richly coal-bearing areas and were thus earmarked for mining. If the major coal areas are mapped today, it would be noted that they are largely located in scheduled areas in the states of Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Maharashtra, Telangana, Madhya Pradesh, etc. All the coal-bearing areas are in the midst or surrounded by tribal habitations. Having discovered coal, the English then went about their task with ruthless precision and denuded tribal areas of their forest and mineral wealth, killed tribal autonomy, and made tribes their virtual serfs in their own land. Even today, coal so extracted is called Gondwana coal. In fact, the northeast states had less coal, and the cost of production in terms of logistics and other things of terrain and climate was considerably higher, and which is why you have one of the basic differences between the 5th and the 6th schedule. The 5th schedule areas were coal-bearing states that the British wanted to reap, and therefore did not risk the idea of conferring autonomy there. However, they encouraged autonomous councils in the northeast, respecting their customs and traditions and allowing them to develop at their own speed along the lines of what they thought was their own genius. Later, this concept has been carried forward and codified as the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution, which allows autonomous districts and autonomous regional councils. The status of the tribes of India, even 70 years after independence, shows that they are the most deprived of our social categories. The majority of the tribes are backward and still dependent on agriculture and forests. The gap between the tribes and the rest of the population has only increased post-liberalization, which goes to show that they have not received full advantage of the various development steps that successive governments have taken. The tribes of India, in my view, serve as a benchmark for assessing improvement in the economic condition of the lowest rung and the level of inequality between the haves and have-nots. Key indicators about the tribes will illustrate their situation, but before that, let me mention the survey that was conducted, which said that the top 1% of Indians command 55% of their wealth. Tribes living below the poverty line in the rural areas and their population, as per the 2011-12 survey, was more than 45% compared to only 25.7% of the overall population. So that's a difference of almost 20 percentage points. And this is when you include the tribal population as well in the overall figure. Only 2.6% scheduled tribes today avail the benefit of government health schemes, relative to 32% of the general population. The child mortality rate amongst STs is 36% relative to 18.4% for the general population. Tribal households with drinking water within their premises are less than 20% relative to 47% for the general population. There are glaring vacancies of teachers in tribal schools and hostels. Not surprisingly, the gap in literacy between the tribes and the general population is at least 15%. In tribal PHCs, that is primary health centers, there are massive shortages of doctors. There are huge gaps in nutritional status, vaccination coverage and institutional delivery coverage. The health infrastructure available for the tribes is weak. There was a reported shortage of some 6,500 sub-centers, 1,250 PHCs and more than 309 community health centers. Of the 8.5 million tribal people who suffered displacement due to dams, mines, industries and wildlife sanctuaries, only about 25% of these were rehabilitated properly. Less than 2% tribal households own mechanized 3 or 4-wheel agricultural equipment, and only 5% have any agricultural equipment at all. Most significantly, only about 2% have formal sector jobs compared to the general population, which is at least 5 times better off. The consumption of STs is the lowest in the country. Their consumption levels are significantly below those of the scheduled castes and even the OBCs. Between 2009-10 and 2011-12, that 2-year period, the decrease in the incidence of rural poverty amongst tribes registered an improvement of only 2 percentage points. Thus, at the existing pace of endeavor to merely reach the economic level of the overall population in 2011-12 will take another 20 years. And this is just for the BPL below the poverty line criterion, not about per capita income, which would be even more steep. The general population will have in the meanwhile surged ahead on all parameters in this time, widening the gap. Thus, the overall difference will be several times more precipitous and glaring and will take them many decades to bridge at the current speed of paying attention to tribes. It is indeed unfortunate that for people who worship forests and whose lives are so intricately intertwined with them, it is the forests that should pose the biggest source of conflict for the tribes. Historically, the Forest Department has accused tribes of cutting trees and denuding forests, attributing this to their habit of shifting cultivation from one area to another. But the end on shifting cultivation and the complete control of forests in the hand of the Forest Department has not led to any significant improvement in the density of forests. I would go as far as to hazard saying that the Forest Department in India has an adversarial relationship with the tribes, because their historical moorings, upbringing and training to protect forests is a commercial resource from the perceived depredations of people who have lived near them, the tribes, was seen to be in competition with the forest department's objective to protect the forests for their planned exploitation. As I said, for the tracks and sleepers in the railway network to be laid in peninsular India and for the development works going on in Europe and Britain. Regretfully, this antithetical approach manifests itself even today in the forest department's treatment of tribes. It would not be wrong to say that the idyllic world is one, and I'm talking of the forest departments, is one without the biotic interferences of the scheduled tribes. So at this point, let us look briefly at the history of forests in India. The British passed the Indian Forest Act in 1865. It was intended to bring under state control forest tracts as per the desire of the state, driven largely by the Englishman's lust for hunting, for game. It's also called sometimes the chase, the lust for the chase or the scent of the game. Indian forests were a free game and overflowing with wildlife, and unlike in Britain where there were strict game laws, Indian forests and Indian wildlife was a khula maidan or an open tract for them. They could hunt, they could shoot, they could go about it wherever they want. But in the process, they got addicted to it and they wanted it to exercise control over it, and they wanted to control it in such a manner that only they could give license to those who wanted to do shikar. So that was one of the underlying motives of the various forest laws. The Forest Act had no provisions to acknowledge, recognize or grant rights to customary users, the tribals. This law was amended in 1878 by which the very nature of common property was changed and forests were brought under direct state control, and by then the Raj had come into being. A new classification was created categorizing forests into three different distinct categories of reserve, protected and village forests. Any rights people enjoyed over forests were seen as concessions that could be withdrawn at will. Essentially, control of the forests was intoxicating and addictive. In 1894, the British government declared its first forest policy resolution in which state control and commercialization of forests again formed the dominant motive. The ostensible aim of this policy was to conserve forests that were under the threat of depletion due to indiscriminate use, but what in effect it did was to strengthen government control over forests and enable to further exploit forests and supplement state revenue and hold all licenses for shikar. The key British legislation on forests was the Indian Forest Act of 1927, which prevails even today. This act tried to consolidate laws relating to a number of issues regarding forests and forest produce. The 1952 forest policy further amplified the intention of the state to monopolize forests. Village communities in the neighborhood of a forest will naturally make greater use of its products for the satisfaction of their domestic and agricultural needs. Such use, however, would in no event be permitted at the cost of national interests. So they had pre-emphasized the power of eminent domain. The accident of village being situated close to a forest does not prejudice the right of the country as a whole to receive the benefits of a national asset. That has continued to be the dominant theme because of the Imperial Forest Service was created by the German botanist Dietrich Brandis, the father of what is known today as the working plan for forestry, along the lines of how the British intended them to be when they set up the Forest Research Institute. The stated mandate of the service was scientific management of the forest to exploit it on a sustained basis for primarily timber products. Even later, the National Commission of Agriculture too had extended this thought, and with the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, forests were transferred from the state list under the 7th schedule of the concurrent list, bringing that within the purview of the centre. The Forest Conservation Act was passed in 1980 with epochal ramifications for the tribes who had historically dwelt in the forests. This amendment was after the Forest Department was transferred from under the Ministry of Agriculture, and there is an implication to its transfer from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Environment and Forests, thus shifting the focus from revenue earning where tribes could be employed to serve the Forest Department to one of conservation. This act aimed at conservation of forests and wildlife and greater state control. It resulted in greater state control in reserve forests and provided for penal measures in case of contravention of these provisions. It also sought to ensure that encroachers of forest land for purposes of cultivation or other purposes were kept out at all costs. And the Forest Conservation Act today has been one of the most deleterious instruments of modern state policy vis-a-vis the scheduled tribes, because they have survived and sustained on forests. They have had a symbiotic relationship for the forests, whereas the Forest Conservation Act sought to throw them out, treating them as interlopers and encroachers. Only in the National Forest Policy of 88 that for the first time tribal needs were reconciled and recognition was given to the fact that the rights and concessions of tribal people and others whose life depend on forests should be fully protected. The principal aim was to ensure environmental stability and ecological balance between all life forms. However, there was a catch. The rights and concessions should always remain related to the carrying capacity of forests. 1995 come the Godavarman case before the Supreme Court through a PIL by environmental friendly activists against, and in a very narrow view of what is environment. They thought the forests are the environment. Very frankly, I differ with that view. I think human beings are more important than the forests. And until and unless you can keep in view the centrality of the human being, any amount of forest or any amount of environment has no relevance. It is just a physical asset. Unfortunately, the outcome, and I know I'm going to spark off a debate on that, but it's interesting. Unfortunately, the outcome of this case was a set of Supreme Court orders that effectively sealed the fate of tribes who lived in the forests. When the court forbade the union government to allow indiscriminate encroachments without its permission, it was interpreted as a carte blanche to the forest department to evict tribes. Widespread protests ensued. Recognizing the need to address the problem for once and for all, the government of the day discussed the subject of forest encroachments in the National Advisory Council in 2004, and this was when it was felt that appropriate legislation should be drafted for the settlement of tribal rights, the rights of tribal communities, along with verification of eligible encroachments. Both in colonial times and in independent India, forest areas were delineated in a summary manner, without taking into account the rights and livelihood consideration of forest-dwelling tribes. The problems of these communities were compounded, as I said, after the Forest Conservation Act, and essentially by the concept of Western property rights law being enforced upon a people who were happy to live the way they lived. Tribes did not have any documents. Tribes did not have any record of rights. But Western property rights required you to have property rights, required your land to be demarcated, delineated, and never really recognized anything as a community right. The entire focus was on individual rights. So people who were living peacefully were suddenly disturbed. Many tribes were left without any entitlement to the land which was rightfully theirs, simply because the land had been taken away from them for forestry operations and they had no means of protesting. The biggest problem with tribes today in all facets of life is their inability to articulate their grievances, their inability to communicate, their inability to fight for their rights. Those who were inside the forests suddenly lost their identity and became encroachers on the very land on which they had thrived all along. And what happens when you deprive a community which has all along sustained on a forest? You deprive them of the incentive to safeguard the forests. So that again has been a major milestone in the history and development of our forest environment. The Forest Rights Act clearly was a historic milestone which sought to correct the injustice which was meted out to the tribes in the process of colonization, because it ensured for the first time the rights and livelihoods of forest-dwelling communities, essentially the scheduled tribes. As is stated in the preamble to the Forest Rights Act, forest rights under pre-existing forest and wildlife laws were not adequately recognized in the consolidation of state forests during the colonial period and then again in independent India. It allows for reopening of cases even in national parks and sanctuaries. The FRA, the Forest Rights Act, is based on the premise that forest-dwelling communities are integral to the very survival and sustainability of the forest ecosystems and therefore invests such communities with responsibilities and authority for sustainable use conservation of biodiversity, and maintenance of ecological balance. We must remember that 38% of India's forest cover lies in the scheduled areas. Despite acceptance today of 44% claims under the Forest Rights Act, and which is actually, we'll talk about it in due course, which is not a good figure. Contrary to the fears expressed by the Forest Department officials, the overall forest cover in India today has actually gone up. The 2017 State of the Forest Report says that the increase in the forest cover has been observed as 6,778 square kilometers and that of tree cover is 1,243 square kilometers. The increase in forest cover has been observed in very dense forest. In fact, the State of the Forest Report says that the total forest cover in the 215, and this is the only mention about tribal in the entire State of the Forest Report, says that the total forest cover in the 215 tribal districts across 27 states and union territories is 4,21,170 square kilometers, which is 37.43% of the geographical area of these districts, and that there has been a net increase of 86.89 square kilometers in the forest cover in these districts. Clearly, it is the tribes who have protected forests and have conserved them. There may be, some states may show slight depletions of forest cover, but overall, if you look at the net balance, as the report says, there has been an increase. So what can be a bigger certificate of acclaim for the tribes? The total forest cover in India, incidentally, is about 7 lakh square kilometers, or 21% of the entire geographical area of India. And empirically, in terms of perception, this fact is further borne out by the example, for instance, where tribes still undisturbed in forests. Take, for instance, the Sentinel Islands of the Andamans. There, the forests have not vanished, but are clearly conserved. It is only when the tribes are extricated from their natural environment that forests are subject to threats of denudation. The vanishing of forest cover has to do with the exploitation of forest wealth for minerals, timber for modern industry, never for letting tribes sustain on it, and vice versa. However, there are still large areas which are neither clearly on the books of the Forest Department, and this is one of the prevalent issues, or the Revenue Department. These are called unsurveyed villages. These were villages which were kept out of the purview of the working plan for whatever reason, because they were considered impractical to use, or they were unconnected areas, or because the forests there were not of a very good nature, timber-bearing nature, or it was logistically difficult or unremunerative in terms of cost-benefit analysis to work there. Or there were unrecorded habitations which have forests. As per the 12th December 1997 Godavardhan Supreme Court judgment, they too classify as forests and therefore can be allotted under the Forest Rights Act. However, they cannot be used by tribes because of the prevalence of the Forest Conservation Act. Such FRA pattas do not confer title on them. Section 4.1 of the FRA comes with a non-obstant clause, that is, forest rights are recognized and vested, notwithstanding anything contained in any other law for the time being in force. So while in effect under the FRA, as a matter of scrupulous choice, there should not be any need for conversion of forest villages into revenue villages, but practically speaking, the Forest Department has obstructed granting of rights under FRA on this ground. If the various ground level committees do not send a proposal for approval, the district level committee has no choice but to unfortunately reject the claim. So as I mentioned, there are a large number of forest villages all across that are sought to be converted to revenue villages. I'll give you just one instance of Madhya Pradesh. There are something like 925 such forest villages for which the proposal has been going up and down between the state government and the central government, where they have not yet been converted into revenue villages. Has the FRA been implemented, and I consider it one of the most powerful legislations of its time, been implemented properly? Under the Forest Rights Act, total claims filed were, as per the statistics that I have from the ministries, about 41,89,712. Of the 40,36,805 individual claims, only about 44% claims have been approved. Of the 1,43,000 plus community claims, only 48% were approved. In some states, the approval rate is sensationally poor. For example, Karnataka, where out of 2.7 lakh individual claims, only some 14,667 claims or 5.5% were approved. So there is clearly a disconnect. There is clearly something wrong which needs to be looked at. What have been the flaws in the implementation of the Forest Rights Act? So meetings at the initial tier, the Forest Rights Committee, were not always held at the hamlet level. Now, tribes do not live as one contiguous whole, as one village. They spread themselves out across majras, tolas, paras, and different hamlets. So you have to necessarily hold those meetings at the level of a hamlet. But if you hold them at the level of a panchayat, then you will not get satisfactory results, because those panchayats are driven by forest guards, are driven by the panchayat secretary, who has no interest in safeguarding in most cases, of the rights of the forest dweller. So the objective of mandating meetings at the Gram Sabha level was that people should know each other and therefore arrive at the right conclusions. That was the lowest tier. So the Gram Sabha would have to recommend, then it would go to the subdivisional level committee, SDLC. From the SDLC, it would go to the district level committee. And the SDLC was not a committee that could refuse. SDLC only had to forward. But in most cases, we have found in several cases that SDLCs have been rejecting claims and have not carried them forward to the DLCs. However, when meetings are convened at the Gram Panchayat level, there is a problem, because the Gram Panchayat comprises several villages. There is a sense of indifference to localized situations, and they are more amenable to the ministrations of the official machinery, namely the forest and the revenue department. In fact, the Forest Rights Act allows the secretary of the FRC to maintain minutes of their meeting without the presence of the Panchayat secretary, but in practice that has not happened. Further, when meetings are held at the Panchayat level, if the terrain is difficult, travelling from one village to the Panchayat headquarters or from a remote hamlet is truly challenging. So that's a logistical issue. With the quorum mandated at 50% attendance of claimants, if you have a Panchayat level quorum, you will never meet the quorum. This quorum is difficult to fulfill if the meetings are at the Panchayat level. Practically no forest rights have been accepted for tribes staying in the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries and tiger reserves. In fact, the FRA is duly applicable there also, because the definition of forest land under section 2D describes forest land as land of any description falling within the forest area and includes sanctuaries and national parks. The reason for this is that FRA in any case only recognizes pre-existing rights which are already being exercised in ecologically sensitive areas. No new rights are being created. Forest officials have generally exercised the caveat provided by section 4.2 of the Act, that where there is a potential threat to critical wildlife habitats, in such cases critical wildlife habitats may be identified and parts of them may be declared inviolate areas for wildlife protection. Often SDLCs, as I mentioned, have disposed of recommendations at their level, whereas they were only mandated to examine the proposals and send them to the DLCs, and so on. This point I've already made. And another point is that community forest rights have been granted largely for charagas or grazing rights, talab, pangdandi, very sparingly for minor forest produce. And the most important thing for scheduled tribes who thrive and sustain on forests are the minor forest produce. Now, to give you one glaring example, the state of Odisha, for instance, has not allowed tendu patta collection rights under the community forest resource or community forest rights, because they want the state and the state's agencies to manage tendu patta. Even the state of Madhya Pradesh, it is the state Laghu Vanupaj Sangh, the minor forest produce organization, which collects the tendu patta. They no doubt collect it, they store it, they dispose it through auctions, and they finally end up giving a bonus to the tribes, which is perfectly fine and legitimate. But it is not that the tribes are owners of that property. It is not as if they have been groomed to learn to dispose it off, to learn the skills of business themselves. Now, community forest resource, as defined under section 2A of the FRA, as means customary common forest land within the traditional or customary boundaries of the village or seasonal use of landscape in the case of pastoral communities, including reserved forests, and protected areas such as sanctuaries and national parks to which community had traditional access. Section 311 also stipulates that CFR are rights to protect, regenerate or conserve or manage any community forest resource which they have been traditionally protecting, conserving for sustainable use. These provisions are strengthened by Section 5 of the FRA, where it is stated that the Gram Sabha shall have the power to protect the wildlife, forest and biodiversity, ensure that adjoining catchment areas, water sources and other ecological sensitive areas are adequately protected, ensure that the habitat of forest-dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers is preserved from any form of destructive practices affecting their cultural and natural heritage, and ensure that the decisions taken in the Gram Sabha to regulate access to community forest resources and stop any activity which adversely affects the wildlife, animals, forests and the biodiversity are complied with. There is a considerable confusion about the role of the Joint Forest Management Committee and the Gram Sabha and the FRC, the Forest Rights Committee constituted under the Forest Rights rules. The JFM is at the Gram Panchayat level, whereas the Gram Sabha is at the village or even hamlet level. And so on. So I have already mentioned about these things. Now let me come to the subject of displacement. Namita, just keep telling me how much time I have.
About 10 minutes.
Okay. So historically, we are all aware that there has been large-scale displacement of tribes from dams and industrial projects. 37% of all large dam area acquired has been in the scheduled areas. 70% of mining rights are in scheduled areas, and not surprisingly, 90% of mining royalties that are collected by the government are from scheduled areas. Some 12 lakh hectares of forest land has so far been diverted for non-forest use between 1980 and 2009, according to a statistic. Some 400 odd road, railway, irrigation projects are coming up, and these will disturb tribes and people who have been sustaining themselves in the forest like the tribes. The state mining corporations have become fronts for land acquisition for mining projects. I mean, this is a statement I'm making, and I can explain this. I'm making a statement only because I don't want to go expound it, push for shortage of time. Overall, 40% of those displaced are tribes, and that accounts for, as per the department statistics, about 85 lakh tribals displaced, of which 25% only have received adequate relief and rehabilitation. I have been collector of Khandwa. I witnessed the Nanda Sagar land acquisition process. I can talk about it at length. And now we have visited Polavaram, which is going to acquire some 1.62 lakh acres, and something like a lakh of families, 100,000 families, out of which 55,000 are tribal families, are going to be displaced. So that's about 2.5 lakh tribal people are going to be displaced from the Polavaram dam. The Nanda Sagar land acquisition experience was an experience of a failure of a market situation, market failure, because Nanda Sagar had, and this happens with all these major projects, that they are announced much in advance because somebody wants to break the auspicious news to the world. And so the Nanda Sagar had been announced first time in 1900. And it was recorded every year in the Gazette that the Nanda Sagar Dam will come up. So when you have a situation where your entire homestead is announced to be acquired for a project, will there be any buyers for that homestead? There will be no buyers. So we came across a unique situation where the land rates of the villages which were going to be acquired was as low as 500 rupees. And we begged the chief secretary at that time to allow us to take not just the village, and there were no templates, there was no LRI Act. There was nobody to guide you at that time. It was just you as a collector, you were the god. So whatever you wrote was final. But we argued and we said that, look, I mean, how can we give 500 rupees as compensation? So allow us to take a larger area, a larger radius of villages whose average we will compute to be able to award some compensation and jack it up with suitable compensations. And that's how we arrived at something which was pathetically low. I would shudder to look at those records today, but I know we improved it substantially. But even then, by modern yardsticks, those were very low rates of compensation. And the Chanera township, which has come up, Harsood, an entire tehsil was submerged. It's not a village. It's an entire tehsil which was poised for submergence for so many decades, which was submerged. And Chanera is where the relocation has taken place, which is still work in progress. Pulavaram, as I mentioned, is going to be a huge project. Only about 10% of the people who are going to be displaced have so far been rehabilitated. Only 10%. And when is the project going to be completed? 31st December 2018. So there's a lot of work to be done by that government. We've mentioned it in our report, which we handed to the President of India, and we've made some objective recommendations. Take another case of the Rourkela steel plant, which is a famous steel plant. Many of us may have come from that part of the world. And each of these steel plants, and this is just one case example, you could look at Bhilai, you could look at Bokaro and so on. 32,000 acres of land were acquired between about 55 and 75. What a devastating impact in terms of dislocation. Later, the RSP, the Rourkela steel plant, could not use 5,000 acres and they surrendered it to the state government. But this was not allotted to the tribals who had lived there earlier and who had been displaced. This was allotted to various other activities, including automobile shops, housing cooperative societies, and so on. And out of this, about 25,000 acres was tribal land, because this is an entirely scheduled area, entire Rourkela district. In 1973, it had been decided that one person from each displaced family should be provided employment in the RSP. However, in 1986, this facility was withdrawn through a circular of the Bureau of Public Enterprises. The matter went right up to the Supreme Court, and for many years it was contested there. Finally, the Supreme Court ordered almost 1,100 people to be provided employment. Unfortunately, many of those who got employment were not genuine sufferers and were non-tribals. The LRI Act is a significant act, as we are aware, and for the first time there is a mention of scheduled tribes. I'm not going to all that, and there are provisions for favorable treatment for the scheduled tribes and for giving them higher monetary compensation, etc. Now we'll take up another issue, which is, among the key issues for the tribals is the issue of PESA, which you all as researchers would have heard about. Tribal autonomy is sought to be conferred by the 5th and 6th schedules of the Constitution, which has special provision for special treatment for the scheduled tribes. Further, Articles 243M and 243ZC of the Constitution clearly mandate that Part 9 of the Constitution shall not apply to the scheduled areas, only in a limited way and in a special way, and therefore PESA was a bridge between the 5th schedule and 6th schedule and was meant to simplify things for administrators to be able to make things easier and for allowing special autonomy and privileges to the scheduled tribes. However, the implementation of PESA has been abysmal. Maharashtra is the only state which has come anywhere close to implementing PESA. Various committees have been set up by the government. Yours truly also at one time headed a committee which is on record for making recommendations, and we made some limited recommendations. Nobody has ever implemented them. The Bhuria committee has gone into it. I don't think that has been looked at very closely either. And as a result of this, scheduled tribes have never got historically the kind of autonomy, and we can talk about it as we go along in the question answer session. So there is a great need to align all state laws, various other laws, forest laws, etc. with the PESA. The Prevention of Atrocities Act is an act which also affects the scheduled tribes, and often it is felt that it is an act which is grossly being misused. However, that is not the case. there may be instances, sporadic instances of cases where people have misutilized it, but the Supreme Court judgment and the entire basis on which that judgment has been based is, in our view, erroneous, and they have not looked at the NCRB data very closely, where they had relied on false cases. But if you look at other crimes of which are open and which run across the entire spectrum of citizenry, whether it is rapes or it is dacoities or it is kidnapping and abduction, the percentage of false cases in them is in fact more glaring than the number of false cases in the case of scheduled tribes and possibly also scheduled castes. So that is very much there. And we have come across in our commission various cases of scheduled tribe people being exploited, and until and unless the government or the bodies such as this intervene, the police are only too happy not to apply the Prevention of Atrocities Act, especially when the person concerned, the person alleged to have committed the crime, especially when he's a well-to-do person or a person who is influential, PO Act is seldom applied. So there is a need for dealing with this. There is a case, and I'll talk about it, of Madhu of Attapadi in Kerala. This was widely reported of a mentally retarded tribal boy who was beaten up by non-tribals in a horrendous sort of case. So we took that up seriously, and I'll be very happy to talk about some of the learnings from that case. Besides, people think that atrocities can only be of a physical kind, whereas atrocities can also be of a mental kind. And not writing a CR in time can be, or not giving a fair treatment to someone in terms of general working arrangements can also be a form of harassment. But that, unfortunately, is never really looked at very seriously. Lastly, I would talk about tribes and environment. As I mentioned, tribes have worshipped trees historically, and they have their sacred groves amongst the trees. For instance, the tribals of Jharkhand worship a grove of sal trees as what they call their Sharna Sthal. What we say Sharna, they say Sarna Sthal, clearly under the belief that trees absorb carbon dioxide and emit oxygen, sustaining life on our planet. For the tribes, God is in the rivers, mountains and plants. Various sacred groves exist all over the country. Every state and its scheduled tribes have various sacred groves, and various villages have them. There is an issue about TSP spending, which I have mentioned briefly while we were discussing, but I'll be very happy to talk about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would say that the world of the tribe is simple, frugal, self-abnegating. It's a world without any of the sophistry and subterfuge of the modern world. It is a casteless, classless, irreligious and incorruptible world in which you can pray without being preyed upon, in which fellow humans are loved and not lynched, one in which women are respected and not raped, in which people are polite and not political. It is a world in which wealth and prosperity are not benchmarks of success, but a happy family, a bountiful forest, and an unruffled environment is. The tribes and our tribes have to be nurtured along the lines and at the speed that they are comfortable with. Going forward, mankind may soon realize that it desperately wants to go back to where it once came from, and then it would regret if it could not find any example of how it had once lived. Thank you.